Right, welcome everyone to the Flyte contributors meetup. Today is June 22, and well, I'm David Espejo, happy to be your host. Uh, Three reminders this time and a shout out before I forget. And first one is this meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be posted to the Flyte YouTube channel. This time I'm testing out the Phantom AI service for automated transcripts, trying to have better notes. So let's see how it works. And also, well, this meeting falls under Linux Foundation's Code of Conduct. And yeah, big shout out to Bernard for all his commitment, ownership, and work to have the IntelliJ open source licensing working, at least for non-UNI folks, which is great. So yeah, thanks again, Bernard, for this. All right. With that, let me share my screen real quick. On the agenda, feel free to add yourself to attend this list, including your affiliation. All right, anyone joining for the first time? I don't think so. All right, well, next up. All right, any new RFCs, completely new RFCs here in the board? Not this time, but I was wondering if what Yi wants to discuss, you would like to touch it in the open mic section, or you would like to talk about tiny URLs now?
Let's do open mic whenever we do that.
Great, thank you. Right, next up, in the working groups updates. Well, right now we only have one working group, the config overrides working group with Fabio, Bernard, and Byron for now. And yeah, thank you for the notes there. Wondering if there's anything in particular you would like to share, anything blocking you, or what's the current status?
Maybe I can share some. So we've paired a bit between the three of us. So far, I think we have most of the things in place. There was an open question that Dan has answered, I think, sometime last week, around like how to exactly pass what. So there were some things that were unclear to us. I think we should have everything now. Mostly, probably the issue is time to implement the things. So
yeah, this week I couldn't.
Yeah,
next week.
Same here.
Right.
I think at least we know what to do, and I think we can give a status update when we had a bit of time to implement something.
Okay, yeah, I'm wondering if, I don't know if it's too early or not, but if, just to keep in mind that it would be great to eventually have a feedback on what do you think about the whole RFC process. What do you think about the idea of using working groups as an avenue for implementation and ownership? Again, probably not now, but we're open for that kind of feedback anytime. Right. Great. Next up, new ideas in the incubator. Yeah, we have a new one this week by Fabio and yeah, Dennis. So I don't know
Dennis
if you
is
like.
my colleague.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll summarize. This is an annoying one. Sorry about that.
No.
So Dennis is my colleague. We're both on the ops team and run the platform for ML engineers. And something that our ML engineers discovered or complained about is that the retry behavior on preemption is different for different plugins. So there are two types of budgets for retries. One is set by the user in the task decorator. The other is set on the platform, set in the Helm values. One is called just retryable failure, or when in plugins and Propeller, a retryable failure is returned. This counts against the user-defined budget in the task decorator. And then there's also system retryable failure that is counted against the platform configured retry budget. And we use a lot of preemptible or spot instances because we can reduce cost a lot with that. And we discovered that when a normal Python function task gets preempted, in plugins, we try to, it's called demystify failure. So we look at the status updates on the pod. And then when there are certain status codes in there, like node terminated, node shutdown, we interpret them as preemptions. And then we count that against the system retry budget. And when the system retry budget is exhausted but one, we switch to a normal instance, a non-preemptible one, which is a really cool feature, so that at least the last one went through. Now, we do a lot of distributed training with the Kubeflow plugin, and there we don't have access to these status updates from the pod. We only get the status updates from the Kubeflow job, and they don't contain any mentioning of any status codes or shutdown events that could indicate that something is being preempted. So any failure, even if it was a preemption, which is mostly what happens to our Kubeflow jobs, they're counted against the other retry budget, which is usually defined. So it's a bit unintuitive that when a Python function task gets preempted, it is something where the user doesn't have any control over how often that can be retried. That needs to be set on the platform side. Whereas they do have that when they run distributed training, but in the latter case, it's not switched over to a regular instance for the last retry. And we looked pretty deep into the code to see what we could do about that, and we have several proposals of what one could do about that. Yeah, but we would, I think we would like to, if possible, harmonize that behavior, that all plugins behave the same way on preemptions. And I'm interested in what you think about that, but at least our engineers would really like to be able to control how many times something can be retried upon preemption, because we have some trainings that run maybe 1 hour, 2 hour. This should be preempted like once or twice maximum, and we have other trainings that run 2-3 days, and we don't care whether they get preempted 20 times because we have good checkpointing. But we can only for certain plugins configure that on our side. But for the plugins where we can do that, for the Kubeflow one, we don't switch to the non-preemptible instance. And ideally, what we would want, we outlined that here in the proposal, would be that basically any preemption gets counted against the user retry budget, and we switch over to a non-preemptible instance on the last retry. There are other options that we see, maybe there are other ones, but that we outline here, and we like discuss some pros and cons. But I'm really curious what you think about that. Also, that doesn't have to be today. It's a long proposal. So if somebody else to say something about that, I would be interested, but we can also postpone this to next time. Maybe it's that everybody has time to read it. Or was that too fast? Is there a question about this?
I'd love to read more on this. To me, it sounds like this demystification process has a bug in the case of plugins that we might be able to fix.
The problem is that I don't think it's a bug. So the interface of the KH plugins is basically build identity resource, build resource, get state, get how to call it, get task phase or something like that. And the get task phase function of the plugin, it gets the Kubernetes objects. In this case, that's the Kubeflow job, right? It gets that thing, and the status section of that object has certain events, and we look at the events, and then the events tell us the job failed, then we'll return an error. Okay. The problem is that the Kubeflow job doesn't contain any information whether it was a preemption. So we don't have access to information at that point to decide whether it was preempted. It's just not there, the information.
Yeah, and that's where I was going with this. Like, maybe there is a way to, add that information to the events coming from Kubeflow, but I don't know. Like,
But even if you do, like the next kubeful might not have.
Yeah, that's the thing. So we tried to not make it kubeflow, like kubeflow is the example that we discussed at that, but we tried to find something that would work for everything. Because there might be like many operators supported in the future, right? We can't implement the preemption detection behavior that we use in Flyte in all of them. I don't think that's feasible.
So this is just defaulting to count against the preemption retry.
So we have
Right.
several ideas, and probably there are other ones. But our preferred solution would be to say we detect a preemption that is a user retry error, because we have had requests from some users that say, hey, I want my task to be preemptable like 20 times because it runs for 2 days and I can checkpoint quickly, it doesn't matter. And for others, it has to be a low number because it doesn't run very long, the training, they don't have checkpointing, right? So we would love for that to be user configurable. And that would solve the problem, because then the only plugin that can do that, in my opinion, is the pop plugin, right? And if the pop plugin would count that against the user retry budget, then we wouldn't have the problem anymore. The only thing we would need then is the option to say, okay, even on the user retry budget, the last try is non-preemptable, so that we have at least better chances to make it succeed on a last try. Yeah, the alternatives would be that one needs to give the get task phase function of the plugins access to the status objects of the underlying pods. We also have an idea how to do that. Basically, it would boil down to each plugin like in the interface also providing a way to query for the underlying pods. And then we could inject the status objects of these underlying pods into the get task phase function too. But I think on the implementation side, it would be more involved. And the downside that we see is that we still couldn't say, hey, this task here can be preempted 100 times. We don't care because it runs for 2 weeks. Whereas this other one, if it's more than 5 times, let's just not do that. That's we don't have checkpointing. It's not worth it.
But
Yeah.
what happens in this case if you have user that wants to write a task that's interruptible with no retries?
That's interruptible with no retries.
They just want the system retry.
So interruptible would mean they want to use spot instances, but they don't want it to be retriable.
Like
That's
they don't want to retry outside. Like if the task fails, then it should fail. If the task gets preempted, then it should retry.
They're saying not on their own exceptions, but only on.
Yeah. Like only in the
Okay.
case where the node goes away. Okay, then retry. Everything else, don't retry. So then you're asking the user to add retries, right?
That is, yeah, we would be asking the users to add retries, yes, in that proposal. So I see 2 scenarios where a user task would be retried. That's not a system failure. One is out of memory. That is counted against the user retry budget. And the other one is if the user raises a recoverable failure exception. I don't know my exact name, right? In that case, it will be retried too. We don't use that that feature. So for us, retries are basically out of memory and preemptions. That when we retry, because a normal exception in user code doesn't get retried, right? It's not a retriable exception. But yeah, what you said is a valid.
Yeah,
it's a valid point. Yeah.
Can you maybe give us time, give everyone here time to read and think?
Yeah. There is no time pressure on this.
I have just 2 questions. One's this preemption thing. Is that because like somehow it's the Flyte decides that we need to use that resource for something else at this moment?
No.
This is
No.
spot instance, so the node goes away from. It's like
You pay a lot less money for the node, but they take it away at any moment from you. And then you need to figure out why the task is gone, and it's gone because AWS needed the resources for somebody who paid more.
Okay, and then another question I have is, you have a statement in there. It says, we use interruptible tasks for most of our workloads as we implemented robust checkpointing and saw great cost savings. Why?
So spot instances cost roughly like 1/4 to 1/3 to regular instances,
Okay,
but they might take them away at any moment, right?
okay, okay.
And because they might want to take it away at any moment, you have to be able to restart from a fairly recent state. So that's why we have checkpointing.
Got it.
And if you have good checkpointing, it doesn't matter whether your task gets killed. You can just retry from the last checkpoint. And if you do that well, you can save a lot of money.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. That would be it from my side about this. It's a longer text. I'm interested in your opinion, but I understand that now it's difficult to say something about it probably.
All right. Thank you, Fabio. Any other question or comment?
Just a quick comment on this retry. I feel like would be a good opportunity to sort of think about this again, just like the whole experience, because I need to think on this more as well. But there have been times that I've been confused by the behavior. So may or may not be related to this specific proposal, but just voicing.
I think it is.
Yeah,
We also
empathy.
write about that.
Yeah.
We also write about that here, that it's very difficult to understand as a user why your task was retried now, which budget it counted against. And we also have some ideas how to make that more transparent and easier to see. Yeah, we can, David.
Yep. Actually, this is the first time I'm learning that there's a system level retry that's separate from the recoverable Flyte retry. I thought it was all the same. But...
All right. That's great. Yeah, please keep your comments going directly in the discussion. And yeah, remember that the goal of the incubator is to basically answer the question, is this idea a good fit for an RFC? It seems like this one it is. And yeah, please add your comments to the discussion. And thank you, Fabio, for taking the time. All right. Yeah, Hitam was reporting some problems with the screen sharing, but I think seems to be working just fine. All right, next up in the open mic section, we didn't have any other new ideas in the incubator from the last meeting. So we will go to the next section, talk about tiny URLs.
Wait, yeah, I just put that there. That maybe it's not accurate. This is more something that probably should be in the incubator, if not in the or well, should have been an RFC, was not, and the next part of it should also be an RFC. It is currently sitting in design. Can I share my screen?
Absolutely.
Cool. Okay. So a while back, I added this thing to Flyte admin. Like the I guess key point is that if you specify the project domain, execution ID, node, retry, and the output name, you can uniquely determine an output of anything in the Flyte, any metadata in the Flyte system. So from that, I came up with a URL pattern that starts with Flyte : / this has already been implemented in admin. So if you send a URL that looks like this to the get data endpoint, you now get, this will now be fulfilled by the data proxy service get data endpoint. So you can send this over. And the idea was, this is a quick way that you can take outputs from, well, assuming we're going to add some front-end changes to allow to expose this so that you can make this kind of a link click copyable. So click on the output that you want, it copies this URL, and this can be dumped into like a Jupyter notebook, more easily than trying to traverse, like instantiate the remote object and then like fetching the execution, syncing the nodes, and then somehow traversing through all the nodes and finally getting to the thing that you want. So this will just immediately dump the literal that you want. Related to that is that this starts then to, and this was done kind of like just experimentally, like we can, if the community does not appreciate this or like this at all, this can be removed and it's fine. This starts to look like a more generalized artifact service, which is kind of what I wanted to talk about. And this is currently an internal design doc, basically, but I will at some point after this meeting make this an RFC so that we can talk about it more broadly. But I introduce a few things here. And I want to quickly go over like what an artifact service would be good for and what it would do. So as a user, you should be able to do the following things. So one, you should be able to use one locally, by which I mean like the Jupyter use case example. So I have an artifact, I have an output. It was produced somehow by the system. I want to be able to inspect it locally. You should be able to use one as the input to a new workflow execution. So you found something that was produced either by a workflow or a task somewhere in the past. Now you want to use it as an input to one of the inputs for a new workflow run. And you may be able to provide additional metadata. That part's not in the IDL yet. You want to be able to control how the system creates it. So by default, anything, any successful run of any task will produce all of its outputs as individual artifacts. Any successful workflow execution will produce every single output as a separate artifact. And an artifact here again is just basically a literal, like one of the outputs of the system. So you should be able to control how that is done. You should be able to create one locally. So this is supporting the upload case. Like I have some data that I've played around with in a Jupyter notebook. I now want to run a workflow against it. Currently, the behavior for the UX for that is a little awkward. So this should make that streamlined, and it should mirror the upcoming UI change as well. And then you should be able to make generalized queries. So I want to dig into a couple of them more succinctly. So I think that some of these patterns have changed in the PRs, but when I say control creation, control its creation, I mean the name currently is going to be by default. Again, this is all for debate, but the name is just like some relatively unique thing that users don't have control over. If you want to specify the name, you have to, we're going to flip this and make this annotated, but annotate your output type with the artifact instance, and then give it the name that you want. And then optionally, you can also give it a tag. And this part, again, is not implemented yet, but we can think about adding it. So in this way, you can, like, I think we call this alias actually. So tags can be, you can have multiple things called tags, like with the same tag. And alias, you can only have one for a given artifact primary key, I guess. And then create one locally. This is like, you should be able to, again, like take data that you have locally, or like since this is a generalizing on literals, like if you have a very important number or very important string or something, doesn't have to be large, like, and you want to keep track of it, like you can create an artifact out of it and then send it to the artifact store and then reference it in the creation of, in the execution of workflows. This part we're going to pass on. And then query is, users should be able to like find artifacts, but more importantly in the, sorry, I apologize. I was going to set all this up before, but users should be able to declare as the default input a query to the artifact service so that at execution time, whatever has the latest alias and this name in that project and domain, that it will do a search for it and find materialize that artifact and then use that as the default template. And then this is the updated example, I guess not updated, but using alias, setting the output of a task as the latest. So whenever this runs, this will update that tag, and then the next time this runs, it will use that. And then this has implications also to, I don't know, a generalized eventing framework where when this changes, an event should be published, and then things can kick off based on that changing. So that is most of the design or the use cases. There is an IDL PR out for this that creates a new service called the artifact service, and all the messages for it. It will look something akin to the data catalog, because as people here know, the data catalog service currently is functioning mostly just as a memoization. I think there's one team that uses it more broadly at Lyft, but for the most part, it's a bit of a misnomer. It's a data cache. It's not a catalog of any kind. So this kind of eventually possibly may deprecate what data catalog was meant to do, not what it is currently doing. So encourage everyone to look through the data model and the service and see if anyone has any feedback. We're going to do, I think I'll probably get Hatham and I will sit down at some point and do a comparison between this and the existing data catalog structures to see if we missed anything. So there's also a Flyte PR, again, partially done. The implementation of this is not currently done, so we're kind of blocked on it. But I'm looking for, we're gonna write a stub on this, non-performant, fast iterating, stub service that we can quickly iterate on these ideas. And the idea, and assuming that that's there, most of the changes in the current thinking in Flyte Kit and admin are available. Where's the admin here? Data events. So yeah, so it's going to be an event-based system where on successful completion of task executions and workflow execution events, the outputs are extracted and sent off as events to the artifact service. There is some additional information that will need to be filled in, and that may happen either as a reverse call or as part of the admin eventing. So that is that. I wanted to quickly also talk about, well, any questions on that? Does that sound interesting, useful, reasonable to anyone, or are we
No, it definitely does. We use something very similar like that from 1TD currently, where you can also register artifacts. And then we get this plot where we have this lineage graph where we can exactly see, okay, the model version from yesterday, use this data set, version model from the day before, use the same data set. But then a few weeks ago, the same kind of model, but in an older version, use another version of the data set. And I think also in your RC, I briefly saw lineage implications and lineage. I think we could do the same thing with this artifact service here.
I think the idea was I wanted the service to be general enough that it could be implemented, we would implement one, and then if weights and biases wanted to, they could implement one. Yeah,
we wouldn't know. I'm not saying integrated with weights and biases, but just do what we do with weights and biases with Flyte instead.
Yeah. That's
I'm not talking about an integration.
I have a question about the versions concept. Is that if I have made an artifact and then I write again to the store, we're just gonna, you're gonna automatically make another version?
So in the current thinking, it's the things that you overwrite are the aliases. So a duplicate and a new one would be written, and then just the alias would move, like a pointer, basically from the old one to the new one.
Like what Docker images, I guess.
Yeah.
And then, okay, one other question is what about like metadata around the artifact? Like, is that automatically kept? Like, you know, someone's looking at, finds an artifact that's interesting in the store, can they figure out like, how'd that get created? Where'd that come from?
So that's a good question. There is a bit of an abuse currently in this PR, and the hack, if you want to call it that, is this part here. So this says an artifact came from a task execution, a workflow execution, or was an upload, and then in the upload we probably just stored a principal. If you think about what this is, it doesn't really belong in this model. This is more leaning towards the lineage side. So a generalized lineage system, which this does not implement, would also be able to, when you use the output of one workflow as the input to another, or output of a task as the input to another workflow, that relationship should be kept track of. And that information is available in the if you like scrape and parse the admin database, it's derivable. It is not currently, like, this PR and this effort does not cover the emitting of that, because I think there's still a little bit more to be thought through on the lineage side. I think the lineage side, I think we're mostly going to be, well, if my current thinking is that it's mainly just tracking that, like when a user uploads something and when users actively take the action of like using one output as an input to another. And that's the only, if you don't name anything, if you have a given name, then there's more tracking. But if you don't have a named artifact, then that's the only lineage that is useful. So you end up getting like lots of very, very short lineages, but that's okay.
I have one question directly to that, but if we do return named artifacts from tasks, then we can create like a larger lineage graph.
Correct. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay. That's nice.
So again, this is just a start. I'm going to rewrite everything in open source, or rewrite the RFC in open source, and I'll circulate that. But there's like, this kind of ties into the tiny URL thing, because admin can emit in the creation of this request, like set that URL to this thing, and then it would be like instantly workable effectively. If that makes sense. And then, is there anything else on the agenda, David?
Yeah, there are a couple of additional items, but if you had something else to cover, I think we can do it.
I want to ask, completely pivot, and then ask users, everyone here, one quick thing, which is there's some interest in getting a more general data class transformer in Flyte. I wrote a small idea that can kind of like generalize what it means to be a container type. So then you can just implement like a Pydantic one and data class one and an adders one, and then it would just work, basically mapping arbitrary containers to Flyte IDL or Flyte containers. Flyte containers, there's only two currently, univariate lists and univariate maps. This is kind of limiting. It's currently not going to work because in this PR, it was started by Eli, Greg picked it up, and I'm trying to make another PR into it. The data class is translated into a literal map, and literal maps are currently entirely univariate. So the compilation step fails. So this is not workable today as it stands. The reason that the existing data class JSON transformer works is because it serializes everything to a scalar. And the mapping there is something that the compiler has no problem understanding. So I wanted to get people's thoughts on, I don't know, how if people thought this might be useful, if they found if multivariate container types are something that we should even think about investing time. Ethan will have an input, and he walked in at just the right moment. Hey guys. Hope you're doing well. Oh, I don't know if people can see me. Hello.
You're welcome.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I was a little late. Yeah, multivariate container types. I actually hate multivariate container types, but that should not be the reason why we do something or no. I think my thing is like, I think will we lose the metadata, like once we do this today, which doesn't work very well, I've realized, but the JSON schema that we extract from the data class drives the front-end validator and the form creator. If we move it to a pure map or dictionary, we have no schema. So you could essentially pass whatever you want. And in the end, that will cause downstream problems at the point when you receive it. Because there's no structure. Now, that may be acceptable. I just don't know if that's the right thing that we should do or not. Like entering JSONs in the UI is horrible.
Maybe a bit of feedback from us. We do have lots of complex configuration and for our workflows, and input and output serialization, as well as inputting that into the UI, is one of the biggest use of feedback things that we get usually. Either some stuff that just doesn't serialize and people work around it in the weirdest ways. So we have constructs that are somewhat crazy. And sometimes also, yeah, entering a JSON in a UI has its own tricky bits. So we've also worked around that a little.
That's interesting. So we use this library called React Farm. I think React JSON Farm or something. The problem that it has is if it has multiple schemas, it just doesn't work. It only works with one schema. And usually what ends up happening is if you use, let's say, a data class that has a Flyte file and something else in it, it creates multiple schemas out of it. And then the UI just says, I'm not going to render it. And it does this. It's not obvious to the user when the JSON will be a big text box where you just enter JSON or when it becomes a form, right? And I think it's just not a great UX. In Flyte CLI now, or PyFlyte run, I think this has become better where you can actually put a JSON as an input. And the validation happens in the Python side because the code exists. So you can actually try and assert the creation of the data class and that will fail. But in the UI, that doesn't exist. And if you ever want to do PyFlyte run from a remote entity, that will not work. So I do think this is not a great experience. Writing JSONs in the UI. But I do see why he wants to do this because it's much more bug-free in the actual engine and translation, etc., or in the DSL.
It's just a common thing that people do in Python that is not like that have no parallel, right? And people very often do freeform structs, data classes, whatever, in Python.
Yeah, for training ML models, you typically have a config that has a learning rate, has a batch size. Maybe it has your model in there, then some strings for loss function. I think. One point that I want to bring up, Arthur, I think it's also on the call, and I mean, Arthur has been doing the coding work. I've reviewed it, have been working on one implementation of a pedantic base model transformer. And I had the thought that it would be great if we could just convert it to a dictionary. And then there was one literal type in Flyte that could just take the dictionary. And then we transport it to the other side and take it out of the dictionary again and parse the dictionary into the base model. And have such a type that works for basically a dictionary, a base model, data class. So there was a thought in me. I wish that existed, because that would make it much easier. And I mean, one thing that I want to bring up is that I think one thing that happens very early when people adopt Flyte is that they pass a dict to something, and the dict has a float and an integer, and then they're very surprised to a day later find out that their code broke because all of a sudden their batch size is a float. And then you need to sit down with them and have to talk about what serialization and deserialization means, which is something that works so well that people don't realize it's happening, right? And it happened several times already. That was the first time that somebody that I explained to people, okay, this is what's happening in the background to make this all happen. And it's very unfortunate that JSON and protobuf don't have they only have numbers and don't have floats and integers. Yeah, I can't comment whether this would work well, but I have wished several times for just one implementation to put a multivariate dictionary into Flyte literal and be able to transport it to another task. Because it's just something that happens often in machine learning that you need to do it.
Yeah.
It's a great argument.
Yeah, great argument, because I think multivariate dictionaries are supported by Flyte idea. It's just literally hidden in Flyte kit.
What? No. Multivariate types. It's supported in the literal. It's not supported in the type.
Yeah.
No, it's not hidden in at all. No.
Oh, that's true. The type did
The
not.
type is the
support it.
problem. The
Yeah.
type is where so everything worked on the Flyte kit side except the compiler.
Yes,
Held that
exactly.
compiler. Yes.
Yes, so yes, the type doesn't, but that's very hard then. What's the type? It should be generic dictionary with a struct metadata if you can have. Because it's very hard to.
But Parallel doesn't know
type.
how to bind multiple things to that.
How do you know? No, so for data classes, when they convert to JSONs, it binds by comparing the metadata.
But it only binds one binding per data class currently.
One binding per data class?
Yes, it's a scalar. It binds one per data class.
Yeah, which oh, you mean how do you combine together?
Yes. So and I guess this is something that I thought I don't know, I thought was interesting. Useful. Maybe it's not useful, but I can't see it.
Pydantic exists for a reason in Python, right? Because that's a big Python problem. And what we have an internal type transformer for Pydantic based models. Now we're working on the public one, and you can from a base model extract a schema. There is a .schema method, and we put that schema actually into the Flyte literal to have it at deserialization time and compare. It's a bit ugly, but it makes all these issues with the integers and floats go away, because we can just extract from the schema what it needs to be. We can compare the schema of the serialized value to the schema of the expected Python type, and then catch when somebody tries to deserialize a child class that has more attributes from the literal parent class value.
Is this a Fabio? Is this a JSON schema? Like, what is this output?
Yeah, it's a JSON schema. Yeah,
I see.
No.
I guess from my understanding of this discussion so far, the reason we haven't done this approach of just writing it into a dictionary and capturing the metadata is it the UI experience? Because like my thought there is there are tons of tools out there that just make the JSON editor in the UI like much better. You know, instead of like producing a form, having a JSON type text field that like behaves nicely, right? You press enter and then it'll like do the indentation, it'll like check certain things. Like, is that something that we can do?
I think that's on the UI side, that's true. On the in one of the issues I think is, and where we're seeing a lot of problems is we want people put in recursive structures. So structure like a file inside a data class. And then that or a data frame, and then that needs special handling because that needs to run through the type engine again.
It's not recursive, it's like nested.
Nested, sure.
Yeah. But like he's saying that, even if I think we should improve the JSON editor. I really like it instead of doing forms. The problem is there is no enforcement on any of those. Like you can put whatever you want, right? Instead of a data frame, you could say X equals to int 1. And then it'll take it and like, it doesn't work.
Wait,
And
wait,
probably
but,
that's okay.
but if we get, like, I'm assuming here that we have, that like the JSON schema is somewhere accessible in the literal, right? Or am I
It
wrong?
is today. If you
Like,
can extract it.
Yeah, can't that be extracted at the UI side so that you can do validation on the JSON blob or string that's being passed in?
That's what we do today, but instead of just validation, it generates the entire form using the schema. But what you're saying, it take the JSON, validate through the JSON schema validator.
Yeah.
And
Like basically offload this problem, just the UI problem to
to the
kind of
admin.
like, you know, I'm imagining a UX where it's like the thing is wrong and then it'll kind of like highlight a little red thing where the, you know, kind of like the VS Code when
Yeah.
like I'm editing my config and there's an invalid option. But yeah, the nested thing, yeah, I guess we can chat more about that.
I have one more comment. Do we have still time, or I like the idea that I just get a text field in the UI. I can write a YAML or a JSON and I get it gets marked in red if it's not correct. And you raised the question, what happens if we put a pandas data frame into the data class or some nesting level, right? Arthur and I in the proposal for the pedantic type transformer, we use a little bit of a trick. We don't serialize, for example, pandas data or all the Flyte types. Basically, we don't make them JSON serializable. We detect them during serialization and take them out of the base model and put a placeholder in there. So what if you put a pandas data frame into a data class in the UI, you don't have the problem of rendering a pandas data frame, but we create an artifact for that with what you proposed. And then in the UI, you see, okay, you have your JSON representation of your data class, and you don't have the data frame in there because how would we render that? But we make it an artifact which is offloaded somewhere else. You can put another artifact in there of the same type if you want.
The artifact stuff is
Artifact can be JSON. We can make artifact JSON. So we went over that already.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, what we are getting to is actually the JSON schema is kind of required almost, right? Like, to do any of this, you need the JSON schema. And so we keep what it is today. It seems like we kind of like make it work somehow better instead of adding a new because there's no multivariate type you can create. The multivariate type is going to look like a JSON schema. Right? Yes. Yeah, which is this is very hard to build. Let's use JSON schema. Now the other problem is what Fabi also mentioned is that the stupid protobuf JSON doesn't support integers or everything's a number, right? Which is a float. If we could, maybe we should use binary serialization, maybe. But that's not good to visualize it in the UI. I don't know what the solution is. Yeah, you guys are smarter than me, so you guys should figure it out.
Are we able to create a data class leader type?
No, there is, right?
No.
Which is structure. What will the type be in protobuf?
It's a map. The key is a string, and then the value is leader type.
Yeah, so that's what you could do. Instead of using structure as a transport, use dictionaries as the transport. And I think it still has a metadata field. Does it not?
That's not what he's saying, but yes.
Yeah, like you don't have to create a new type. You can just use dictionaries in the back as a transport with a metadata field, and we change the behavior in UI that if you see a metadata field, then you give a JSON editor, which you can edit with a schema. We can do that.
Yeah, okay, but that's not what he's saying. That's not what Kevin is saying, make it a map. So instead of map value type being a single thing, it's a dictionary, which is the recursive.
But then I think there's one other problem of this recursive thing of literals and literal is performance. There's no easy way to deserialize this, like from JSON to data class. You'll have to manually write all of this deserialization. Pydantic has spent so much time in improving the performance of this stuff, right? Like it's just like they literally built Pydantic 2 for performance. And I'm like, why are we taking that away?
Okay, is there any like possibility, or is this a very bad idea? Probably is, of being able to bind multiple things to a scalar.
What do you mean? You already do that. What do you mean by multiple things?
Two outputs from two different tasks going to one scalar? No, okay.
No, the definition of scalar is changed.
It's
Okay.
gonna be
Yeah,
kind of easy.
because the engine becomes, then propeller becomes.
Okay.
Like
just making
it's
sure.
stable and reliable because of these problems, right? Do not want to affect reliability based on like, oh
Okay.
yeah. I would make data class JSONs, something like just find a better way to represent JSONs in the system. That's literally what it turns out to be in my opinion. And it could be message back. And then we just say that the format of a binary is message back and the UI has a
Yeah,
message
the
back
UI
decoder that shows nicely in the UI. And that's okay, right? That works great. Message back is nicely, there are libraries, I think, available everywhere.
And they would have support for integers.
Yeah, because it's JSON.
Okay.
Anyways,
Right,
Alright.
that's pretty. We will
Hot
have to
topic.
continue discussion this topic, I think. So yeah, thank you Yi, for sharing with the community. I will ask you to please share the links to for the relevant PRs in the agenda.
Yep.
So anyone can take a look. All right, we're short on time. Next up, type support for Pydantic. Arthur and Fabio, they're working on this, which is great. But they will need a review from someone from Union.
Yeah, I'll say one sentence. We have been iterating on it, like two rounds of iteration. We'll talk tomorrow to discuss some final questions. I'll leave one review, and then I think somebody from your side needs to look over it. It's for a plugin that introduces a type transformer for base models that we just talked about. What you're thinking about has implications for that, right? If there was a type that we could just put a multivariate dict into it, then that would maybe be easier. But this is just a heads up that there's stuff like work going on there. We'll need some other eyes in the future.
Does this implementation support the whole data frame thing, like Flyte files and Flyte
Yes.
directories thing?
All
Awesome.
flight types.
Nice.
And it also does so with only like it uses the Flyte type engine. It doesn't, you don't need to implement any JSON serialization of the Flyte types for Pydantic.
Beautiful.
All right.
so what's happening then? Are all of these people working together to get one out?
Well,
Because Fabio has one, Arthur has one, there's one more, Eli.
Oh,
You look great.
Fabio's and mine are the same. Arthur speaking.
there's only two.
Yeah.
One for data class, one for
We're working on the same thing. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, but we
That's
haven't synced with Eli. That is true that he's also working on it.
Yeah, I don't know if there's not multivariate, I don't know if there's a way to generalize data class and Pydantic and adder. So this may have to be like three.
I would think there could be a link between these as long as they serialize to JSON. The framework we're using is pretty much agnostic to Pydantic. The only assumption we're making is that we're able to catch these Flyte supported objects when serializing to JSON and pick them out. And then when we deserialize, we just replace those placeholders back with the objects themselves, and that will then deserialize into the object again. So I can't recall if Attr supports that, but I know you can implement, you can configure it to do that somehow. At least the JSON serialization part, if you have reasonable objects in there.
Got it.
Yeah, I think we should solve the JSON transport. But there's one thing I would like to also keep in mind when we solve the JSON transport is allow us to have the capability of have a JSON path indexing into it, because that has been asked by a lot of people where you output a data class and then only a part of it is just sent to a task.
So you want Propeller to do that?
Propeller can do it if it's JSON path based stuff. Because it already loads the JSON in memory, right?
But that deprecates name tuple.
What do you mean?
That can deprecate name tuple, right?
Oh, why? Oh, always use.
Yeah.
Okay, I always use that.
Okay, I don't know the answer to it.
No, that's good. We want to get rid of that.
Okay. Yeah, maybe.
Okay.
Propeller can do it. I don't think that's a lot of work. You just have to have a capture in like the bindings of the JSON path of the upstream object, and that's
fine.
it, right? I think,
That's fine. It's easy to do in package.
yeah, and propeller will work. I know that part.
Okay, the one quick thing I wanted to mention, Niels again mentioned, we were talking about this earlier. The effort for fractional and different GPU types. We're looking for input on the Flyte kit user experience side. So anyone who has a opinion, we will be reaching out. Cool.
Actually, I'll give a talk next week, or next Tuesday. And part of that is about selecting GPU types.
Oh, awesome. Okay.
In the community, in the community
Yeah,
center.
I created a quick stub RFC incubator.
Oh, nice.
Nothing much in there, just stating the problem and like giving an example of what Flyte kit API might look like. But yeah, we're pretty short on time, so.
Yeah.
I would have one small question on whether Dan is out or not, if someone knows.
Dan's out, yes. He's on vacation
Okay.
this week.
Okay, for this week, and he'll be back next week.
Sorry, what?
Will he be back next week? Just because so we have like a fix
He'll be
up.
back next week. He'll be back.
Okay,
next week.
sweet. Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, I just added to the agenda the link to the RFC incubator entry from Niels. And with that, we are at the end of the agenda. Anything else that you will be able to cover in less than 2 minutes? I don't think so, right? Right, with that, thank you all for your time. It was great. Thank you for joining, and I hope to see you in the next one.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.